So the idea for tonight, I mean, we have three very accomplished artists, but we're also in the Aleph dinner. So to try to combine the Judaism and the artists, I'm going to be asking some questions, but it's not like we're having a presidential debate. I'm going to throw out an idea or a question, and I'm starting with you, Danielle, and then everybody should kind of riff off of that. And so how I incorporate it into this dinner is I'm going to read a few lines from something that the rabbi wrote in his book, The Age in Creativity. There are people who are creative and innovative in whatever they do, while there are others, including some important and significant creators, whose creativity is limited to one or two areas, and in everything else are quite ordinary. Similarly, there are many people who focus their creative talents deliberately, mistakenly, or by coincidence on unimportant things. On the other hand, even about truly creative people or stature, one can ask whether their creativity was imposed upon them or was coincidental, since many of them do not always correctly evaluate the genuinely significant aspects of their creativity. So my question, and as an example, I'm choosing you first because you started out as a musician. So I'd like you maybe to speak to this piece and like, was it imposed on you? How did this happen?
No, I think, first of all, I think that every person is creative. I don't think this is a professional distinction. Creativity belongs to all people, everywhere. I've never met someone who's not creative. Creativity is an expression of something very mysterious, because we can think of creativity, in a sense, ahead towards creativity. We can reflect backwards on creativity, but the moment of creativity is not something we can talk about. We don't really know where it comes from. It's not something that you can rationalize. It's not determinable within the linguistic structure. So to me, creativity is certainly not coincidental. It's not something that you stumble upon. It's a fundamental aspect of the human being. And the rabbi spoke eloquently in citing the freedom given to humanity through a kind of process that you could say divine, transcendent, or call it whatever you want. But that definitely is a passion that is not an individual undertaking. It's not something you fabricate. It's not something you can order. It's something that you are part of. And I know that sounds maybe even sort of slightly suspicious. What does that mean? But it means that creativity, whether it's in music, in drawing, in building, and here I must bring architecture because it's to me very different from music, very different in a sense from art itself, because it's always limited by a public engagement. When you're an architect, you can't sit alone and do something. You're part of something else, which is the community, society, cultural expression, and yet architecture in some way, because it's so bound by laws and orders and parameters that are not free, is in a way, to me, one of the most free arts, paradoxically, because it uses the heaviest materials. It requires a huge effort. To even build a small house, you required a huge effort and a huge sense of connection. So to me, I don't know whether I was able to answer your question, but creativity is certainly not a coincidence. It's not stumbling upon something. It's a fundamental aspect of the world. And by the way, all the words that we have in reality, foundations, horizons, possibilities, aspiration, come from architecture, because architecture lays foundations. Architecture exposes, creates a window, a door, and in a strange sense, it's a home. Creativity is about home, and it's being at home in a homeless world in many ways. So, being an architect has been a kind of affirmation to me of the fact that creativity is intersubjective. It requires huge teams to build a building, never mind ground zero, which requires thousands and thousands of workers, maybe hundreds of thousands of people ultimately to create such a... So creativity extends beyond certainly the initial spark. It's a spark that has to be maintained and flamed into a fire in order to actually build something.
Well, let's shift that over to music and Beryl, your art. Do you want to speak to that?
No.
How about you, Steve?
I can't say anything about creativity. I really can't. Not because I know something because I don't know what to say. But one thing that Daniel mentioned that did ring true is limits. Limits. I think basically for me to write music, I just have to put in lots of hours. If you sit around waiting for inspiration, you will wait until you are buried. And for me, for instance, I'd say 99% of my music has been written between 12 noon and 12 midnight. I can't work early. It's an observation about, well, what time of day am I really on? Yeah. And so that enters into it. Writing a piece of music, it's sitting in a place of Stephen Sondheim talked about this, a blank piece of paper is terrifying. So what do? Well, what instruments am I writing for? And how many are there? About how long is the piece going to be? This immediately brings into the fact that whatever I write, eventually it's got to be played by other people, even if I'm a part of the group. So, as Daniel said, it's for himself and for any composer, you are part of a community, and if you're not, then you're not, unless you're a pianist who plays solo piano music, like Chopin or something. You're isolated. You're not part of the world in which you are trying to be. Mm-hmm. And I think really that at the moment that's all I have to say on the subject.
So, but you're with a group. You're solo.
Yes.
So you have a harder time.
Well, when I started out, I was anything but solo. I was co-editor of a magazine I started with several other people called Radical Software. What was Radical Software? It was trying to change the relationship of people to the information that they were receiving via broadcast television. This was in the late 1960s. And it was trying to get to begin to create work in a video medium that hadn't existed before for a new way of conveying information and of conceiving information. I got involved in the early 70s in what we call multiple channel work because I was trying to come up with strategies to get people out of the living room and into a public space to begin to look at this new medium. And through the relationship of time across multiple channels and a new way of approaching narrative, it was a way of doing that. Later on and in other parts of my life, as I've progressed, it's become sometimes more solitary. At the beginning, it was very much involved with a group of people beginning a developing vocabulary, and that's varied.
Well, that answered a lot. I'm going to shift a little bit over, and I'll either start with you, Beryl, if you want, or you, Steve. And this is basically, in all your work, you've had a piece or two or three or four, whatever, that had some kind of Jewish connection. You did the Berlin Jewish Museum, the Cave, Dachau. Could you maybe speak a little bit to how you got there?
Yeah. In 1974, when I was working at Radical Software, actually, it was a very important year for me, 1974, because I was working in 3 media at the same time. One was as the editor of this magazine that I no longer wanted to edit and was kind of moving away from. The other was beginning to make my first videotapes. And at the same time, I became very interested in the hand loom as the first computer on the face of the earth, in that it programmed patterns according to a numerical structure. And what was really interesting at the time was when I realized that the information in all 3 media, weaving, loom, and print, was encrypted in lines. And this began to tell me something about technology and how human beings organized information. Cut to, I was invited to Berlin by my then boyfriend And I said, well, I can't really come to Germany without going to Dachau. I just can't do that at this point. So I came and I visited him in Berlin and made a trip to Dachau and walked around and was astonished that, and I had no idea, I didn't bring a camera with me, and the first day I left it back in the hotel room. And to me it was a tourist place, 1974, not what I had been raised to know, and I couldn't know, and this is what I found. And so I took my camera, but what was there? What was there were barracks, long corridors, tremendous symmetry, and everything very cleaned up. And so I took my camera and, starting from the outside of the camp through to the inside, made this work. Very much on a tripod, tourists murmuring inside barracks, whatever. But when I came back to my studio, I had a lot of images on a tripod. And what I was telling you before about these different influences at the same time is I thought, gee, I'm going to make this a 4-channel work, and I'm going to base it on weaving structures, because somehow this ancient structure of combining threads and multiples on a video screen, this is really how the loom was the oldest technology we had in terms of learning how to work with multiples. And so there's a structure that was created for conveying a narrative, but in all my work since then, this structure that was made to embody the content has always been a tension in the work. There's always been a very strong structural framework, and then there's always been something that's had to move me deeply. And going to Germany for the first time and confronting this place that had been in my mind since I was a child, because I remember seeing the first footage when I was very, very young, and then combining it with some of the things that I had been thinking about and working with in a very avant-garde work in New York City came together in that piece. And in subsequent pieces like Text and Commentary, which is now being shown in Germany next week, it was my way of having, when I was introduced to Torah, and for the first time I hadn't been raised that way, I was astonished by the relationship between text and commentary. The Jews don't study Torah as a linear text. So when I wove the text for this work, I had a camera hanging from the ceiling. And in a sense, these two technologies, again, the ancient technology of the loom faces the weaving, but again, it was the Judaism coming in around the edges to give the work its life and meaning to me, but the structures for the work came out of the avant-garde video scene that I was very much a part of. So that's just 2 examples.
Yeah. You have to download this because you can still see it.
I didn't realize you could still see it. Okay, that's good.
Yeah. Steve, how about yourself?
Well, I'll be biographical, autobiographical. I was raised as a Reformed Jew, and I basically grew up knowing nothing about Judaism whatsoever. Didn't know Aleph from Bet. And the result of that was moving as far away from Judaism as possible. And in the 60s, like many people in my generation, we got involved in Southern Buddhist meditation, Northern Buddhist meditation, Transcendental meditation, and for a fast-talking, high-metabolism New Yorker, that was very helpful. In about 1974, shortly before Beryl and I met, I got the feeling something's missing. And I made 3 phone calls, one of which was to Yeshiva University. And they said, we have a great adult education program at Lincoln Square Synagogue with Rabbi then Stephen Riskin and Rabbi Ephraim Buchwald. And I became a Lincoln Square Synagogue Baal Tshuva.
And he later married you.
And yeah, Effie married us. And I actually went to an evening of Rabbi Steinsaltz talking to artists, which was arranged by a mutual friend of Beryl's and I. As I was saying earlier, when Rabbi Steinsaltz had bright red hair. And I became more and more involved. I discovered that the Torah, as Beryl pointed out, as you all know, is read in a cycle. When you finish, you have Simchas Torah, and you start again. There are commentaries, and then there's the idea, well, I'm studying this stuff, what about doing it? So gradually my eating changed, and I began to put the phone machine on Friday night, and all the things that many of you know very, very well, and I began to practice. This is now going on 74, 75, and 76, and I'm going to cut to 1981. I began to feel at that point, well, gee, I want to bring this into my music in a very direct way. And in early pieces of mine, as some of you may know, drumming, music for 18 musicians, I used women's voices, but they were singing, they were imitating the sounds of instruments. And I'm not the first, Ravel does this too. And I thought, well, what if I could bring in a Jewish text, a Hebrew text, and what better text to bring in than Tehillim, Psalms? And I wanted it to be Tehillim and not Psalms. Psalms is basically, Tehillim comes from the same root, Hey Lamed Lamed, as Hallelujah, and Sefer Tehillim means Book of Praises. And I think members of my own family thought that the Psalms were written in Greek. So I wanted to make this partially a corrective for people in the world that I lived in. And so I went through the book of Psalms, the book of Tehillim, with the Hebrew and English edition on the piano, looking for things that I could say to anybody, Jew or non-Jew. And I found 4 excerpts. And the first one is Hashemayim Masaparim Kavod Kel, the 19th Psalm, heavens declare the glory of God. And so, like any composer from when we were living in caves before Machpelah, I said, Hashemayim Masaparim Kavod Kel, and I got Hashemayim Masaparim Kavod Kel. And at the same time, as that tune went through my head, I also got 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. I thought, what's that? And that, it turns out, really is the sort of subterranean memories of my studies of Bartok and Stravinsky, who changed meter a lot. Like the Bulgarian rhythms in Bartok, so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So this just bubbled up. So what the result of all this is that Tehillim became a melodic piece with the singers really singing extended melodies. Beryl used to say to me, as I would walk around the house singing, she said, "You're really singing." So, as opposed to patterns, as opposed to do-do-do-do-do. So Tehillim was a kind of break-through piece. And Zubin Mehta conducted it with the New York Philharmonic, which is a completely unexpected sociological, political reality in my life. And I believe that Tehillim is one of the best pieces I've ever written, and it is performed rather frequently. It's going to be done together with Johann Sebastian Bach at the Miller Theater next year, and you should all come for Cantata No. 4 in Tehillim.
Where's that?
Great program at the Miller Theater at Columbia. Anyway, after that, I felt, well, this is good that I bring my life into my music, and that resulted in the 1980s, my contemporaries, Phil Glass, John Adams, were asked to write operas, and I was invited by the Frankfurt Opera and the Holland Festival in the Netherlands Opera, would you write us an opera? And I said, well, gee, thank you very much. It's really wonderful. I'm terribly flattered, but no, because I'm not really interested in opera. So if you're going to spend three or more years working on something that you don't believe in, you're committing professional suicide. So I didn't want to do that. So I just hung up the phone and I thought to myself, well, this is, big offer. There must be something. Well, I've left something out of the equation. At the time that these questions were coming in, I was working on a piece called Different Trains. This is a wordy answer. This is my longest. I won't go on with this again, I promise. Different Trains was taking early pieces that you mentioned, Come Out and It's Gonna Rain, which used the human voice recordings of someone, looping them so that they repeat, so that you hear the speech melody. Come out to show them, ba-dum, ba-dee-dum, ba-dum, ba-dee-dum. When we speak, we sometimes sing, especially when we get excited or we have some very emotional thing, or children, because they don't control their larynx very well, so they tend to be very melodic. So I was working on Different Trains, which integrate, at the time, the first movement of the piece was about my childhood. My parents were divorced. My father was a lawyer. He lived in New York. My mother was a singer and a lyricist. She lived in Los Angeles. And when they were divorced, when I was 1 year old, the court decided they would have divided custody. Spent 6 months in New York, 6 months in Los Angeles, and go back and forth on the train with my nanny, Virginia. So I went over and I reported Virginia, who was still living. She was in her late 70s. And I found a Pullman porter, black Pullman porter, Lawrence Davis, who was living in Washington, D.C., who rode these same trains at the same time in the 1940s. And for him, it was like that was his day. He was transporting soldiers and sailors from the East Coast to go fight in Japan and from the West Coast to go fight in Europe. And while I was doing this, I was thinking, well, okay, what years did I ride those trains? 1937, 1938, 1939. What was going on in the world? Well, you all know what was going on in the world at that time. And I began thinking, if I had been born, God forbid, in Stuttgart or in Brussels, I wouldn't be sitting here having dinner with you tonight. I would have been going up the chimney. So I began to think, well, what am I doing with Virginia and Mr. Davis? I'm basically, as they speak, so I write. And if it's a woman's voice, the viola would double the woman, and if it's a man's voice, the cello would double the man. And then I began to think, if somebody asked me to write a piece, hey, Steve, would you write a piece about the Holocaust? I'd say, are you crazy? What are we going to do, drink the Atlantic Ocean to start? But I thought, well, wait a minute now. If I were to find tapes, recordings of survivors, and do the exact same thing, what is Virginia doing? She's talking about her life. What is Mr. Davis doing? He's talking about his life. If I were to find tapes of Holocaust survivors who were talking about their life and take parts of those that were musically said,
I had a piece.
I have a piece. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. In the future, what if I could work with a video artist and not just hear the voices, but have videotapes of people and have not just a string quartet, because this is written for the Krono string quartet, but you'd have the musicians playing what people said, that you could see both the interviewee and the musician at the same time. And this gave birth to the cave, and now I'll shut up.
You say everybody's creative. None of us could do that. Go ahead.
Well, I didn't say creativity was something that can be easily expressed. But let me say something about what you asked, which was, you know, do you become Jewish when you do a Jewish museum? Do you become Jewish when you do a synagogue? Are you Jewish when you do a Jewish community center? And I would say, in my case, it does not apply. Because Jewish is not, to me, something I apply to a building. It's not a label on a building. Jewish is everything I do. It's not something I had to rediscover or go to school to learn or research in a library, because I was born to parents who were Holocaust survivors. I grew up in Poland with no members of my family. There were nobody was left in Poland. My parents, my father came from a family of 10. He was, and his sister, the only survivor from Auschwitz, the only people left. There was, he once counted 85 immediate members. That's, we had no uncles, no aunts, no cousins, no grandparents. Growing up in Poland under communism and anti-Semitism, with parents who were Jewish, who were not fellow travelers, who were not assimilated, who did not try to fit in, but were proudly Jewish, we were exposed to what it meant to be Jews in times which were not wholesome. There was tremendous state anti-Semitism and also personal. As kids in school, we were always vulnerable because we were hounded as Jews. And by the way, the reason I became a virtuoso, and I was saying this before, on the accordion, I mean, it's a strange, I was the only person ever to compete in the America-Israel Prize for Music who won the same year with Itzhak Perelman, who was on the board of this Aleph Foundation. I was the only person to play the accordion and win the prize. And Isaac Stern said to me, "Where, Mr. Libeskind?" Well, I don't think he called me Mr. Libeskind. He called me by my first name. "How the hell why are you playing this small piano? Why are you not playing the piano?" And I had to tell him this strange story that I wanted to play the piano, but my parents were afraid to bring the piano because of our neighbors. We lived in one of those typical blocks in a wood, industrial city. And my parents were just too afraid to bring a piano because of the consequences. So they gave me a piano in a suitcase. It was a hidden piano. It was, small. And I was, in a way, destined or doomed to play an instrument which has a limitation. And when Isaac Stern said, you should be playing the big piano, not a small piano, by that time, I realized that going from the vertical to the horizontal is not that easy. Going to the Juilliard, switching, your body, your everything that you do. So what I wanted to say is that when I designed my first building, which was quite late in my life, I did not start by being an architect. As I said, I was a musician. Then I drifted into drawings and then I was a professor of history, of architecture. I was a head of a school of art, artist in residence for years, professor at Harvard, at Yale. But I was also an architect. And I decided not to practice in a conventional way. I never apprenticed myself to an office. I never worked in an architecture office for more than 2 or 3 days because I didn't like it. I didn't think it was interesting what they did and how they did it. So when I competed in the competition for what was then not called the Jewish Museum, it was called the Berlin Museum with the Jüdische Abteilung. It was a German museum, Berlin Museum of History, with a small Abteilung, a Jewish department. And all the architects from Israel, from the United States, many famous Jewish architects, did exactly that. They created a big, major museum, and in the museum they put a small synagogue-like, quote, Jewish space. Well, everything in me rebelled against this idea because I said, Jews should not be seen only as victims of the Holocaust. They should not be seen only as the ghosts that haunt the world, and Europe in particular, and Berlin especially. But they were creators. They were great Berliners. They were great Jews who participated in the successes of Europe, made Europe to what it was, and then, of course, was destroyed. So when I competed, I decided to do a very different kind of building, a building which did not have a Jüdische Abteilung.
Didn't have a what?
Jüdische Abteilung. In German, Jüdische Abteilung means, for those of you who don't know German, Jewish department, a word coined, by the way, by Adolf Eichmann to exterminate Jews. He created a Jüdische Abteilung. So I said, no, I cannot do this. So I created a very different structure, which really wanted to bring together back what you could not see anymore in Berlin, the invisible Berlin, a topography of a city that is not there anymore. An inaudible Berlin, you could not hear those voices, and you could not hear. So I brought Arnold Schoenberg's. I wanted to complete Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron. Musically, how did I do it? In the echoes, in the footsteps of the visitors across a void that I created in the museum. But to go quickly through it, I brought, it's not really even a piece of architecture, it's really para-architectural, because it was not based on existing plans, existing ideas of what a museum should be. There could be no such existing plans for such a museum. Not, by the way, for any architecture, in my view, anyway. But I brought, the text of Walter Benjamin, Paul Celan's poetry written just around that vacuity of space in Europe, Schoenberg's Incomplete Opera, many, and not only Jews, also non-Jews, E.T.A. Hoffmann, the great story writer of Berlin, the Tales of Hoffmann. And by the way, Hoffmann went to Poland. In the 18th century, he was in the Prussian government. In Poland, one of his specialties was to give German names to Jews. I often thought that Libeskind might very well have been invented by E.T.A. Hoffmann. So anyway, to make a long story shorter, I believe that Jewishness is integral to my work. Even if I don't do a Jewish project, I did, the Imperial War Museum in Manchester. It's nothing to do with Jews, it has to do with ongoing conflict. But I thought, the world is shattered in conflicts. It's not really the world we see on, the globe that we see on TV. It's a shattered, fragmented world that wants to come back together. I wasn't really thinking of tikkun. I wasn't thinking all the things I are deeply embedded in Jewish culture, Jewish spirit. But I thought that to express the shards of memory in a place that wants to bring conflicts back into something that could be could be confronted in a positive way. So I mentioned the word memory because to me, the fundamental aspect of what I do, and I believe is fundamental dimension of the Jewish soul, is that memory is not old. Memory is not something that is dead. Memory is not something that we venerate as something which has passed, but memory itself is a living thing. It's alive. We are part of it. It's not in the back. It's also coming towards us from the future. So every project that I built, you mentioned the house that I built in Connecticut. You know, it's just a house. It's a beautiful house. Has nothing to do with Jews. Has nothing to do with the Holocaust. But as a Jew, I always think there is a history in this green space, this nice Connecticut landscape. What happened here? What transpired? What happened on this seemingly beautiful, naive, empty piece of land? There is history. There's no tabula rasa. There is no emptiness. Something has transpired. And to me, that search, which is to me fundamentally Jewish, a search which doesn't end with something obvious. It doesn't end with a theme, doesn't end with a product, doesn't end with an object, but it's itself part of what people really are. And people go beyond simply being their physical selves. They go beyond their psychological selves. They go even beyond having a heart as a pump. There is call it a strange word. The word spiritual is strange in Hebrew, in any word. In any language, the word spiritual sounds strange because it sounds slightly like a hoax. Because, you know, what is the spirit? But to me, a building without a soul is just a piece of equipment. And many buildings in our cities, in our world, are just large-scale, you know, air conditioners, large-scale engines, and I want
As
to go.
you said on one of your tapes, it's a short story.
It's a short story. That's true. And I just want to say something that we accept. You know, 20th century was so full of evils, I would say, because it had ideologies left and right, which were evil because they denied human liberty, they denied individuality. 20th century was a celebration of violence. All those things that culminated in the catastrophe, which was the destruction of Jews and destruction of the world in itself. How does one overcome it? I always think that a building is something of a piece of optimism. It's something of an optimism because it's not a luxury, really. Mostly it's not. If you build in the city, you know, you need it. You need houses to live, hospitals to be healed in, places to go to, streets So that to me is what is Jewish. Jewish is the freedom to affirm what a human being is. And I think, you know, it's strange to me that many intellectuals and really great artists are put into categories, you know, because art can be consumed as a category. But we all go back home. We all go and great scientists, great artists accept very often the world as it is, which I don't. I don't think the world is a nice world, perfect world. I don't think the world is just a good world. It's nice to be here. Everything is going well. So my architecture attempts to create something that maybe is not obvious and maybe it's not even likable initially. You know, when the Jewish Museum opened, it was universally condemned by the press, by all the papers, by all the intellectuals of Germany, even by a number of Jews, as something that will never work, that you know, cannot, you know, no story could be told. But I tried to tell a narrative in architectural terms, which is to do with space, with light, with proportions, materials, how cold the space is, vibrations, and so on. So yes, so I'm just going back. I don't want to go on, but to me, Jewishness belongs to the celebration of life in a very particular way, which is both intellectual and emotional. It's highly intellectual because it's not just a feeling; it's an answer to a call, but it is also deeply emotional because nothing can substitute for the emotion. It's the ultimate communication there. So yes, so I reject the idea of Jewish architects doing Jewish buildings. Not at all. There can be plenty of Jewish architects who are doing Goyish buildings, even if they're called synagogues or Jewish museums. So I do believe in the depth of the Jewish tradition, and I believe myself to be part of it. And we all try to be part of it because it's too big for any person to fulfill that mission, even for the rabbi.
You mentioned optimism, so your structure downtown, that's all about that.
The ground zero, the master, you know, please remember, you're all New Yorkers. Many, you remember that then mayor of New York wanted only low buildings. They said we should not have any tall buildings at ground zero. There were many different, all my colleagues, you know, Norman Foster, Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman, Stephen Hall, created large megastructures in the center of the site. When I came there, when I spoke to the families of victims, I'm a New Yorker, I grew up in the city as an immigrant, I felt that nothing should be built on most of the site. Now, the requirements are 10 million square feet of office density, 5 million square feet of cultural infrastructure, additional 2 million. You have basically a downtown of an American city in this 16-acre site. But I rebelled against the idea of putting things in the middle of the site because it's no longer a piece of real estate, even though it was never declared as anything but a piece of real estate owned by individual developers. And so I said, one should not build where people perished. You can, not only on the surface, not only that I proposed to have the park and a social cultural space, half of the site really, 8 acres is public space, but I thought all the way down to the bedrock, where you know, this space wants to be filled by security, by infrastructure, by being used. It's very expensive space, but I thought a sacred space should be all the way from the street level where you see the footprints of the buildings with the waterfalls, all the way down to bedrock, which is now the museum, and which is structured by that incredible slurry wall, which we should have never seen, which is the foundation really of that site. And I thought that's communicating something which can never be accessed by going on the internet, by reading a book, by seeing movies, because I think when you descend, when anyone descends 75 feet from the street level through the visitor center, deep down into where no one has ever been except workers that construct New York City, at the bedrock, you have that incredible feeling that you are somewhere where no words are adequate to describe because you're next to that wall, and by the way, exposed. A foundation should never be left, you know, you build a foundation in order to cover it. We see dead foundations in Rome or in Greece because they're dead, they're not supporting anything. But I had an idea that these foundations should be exposed in their living sense, and they support the Freedom Tower, which again, I thought it should be not just the tallest building in Western world, which it is today, or Western Hemisphere, but it should be a building which cannot be beaten by a taller building in Nairobi, Mumbai, Shanghai, because 1776, which is the exact height of the apex, is the date of the Declaration of Independence. Oh. And to me, that's what is in the sky of New York. It's the document that created human rights. That's the first document of human rights written in the world that affirms human liberty. And I also, as an immigrant, I passed by the Statue of Liberty, not just on a you know, in a simulated way. Like most immigrants, I stood on the deck at 4 o'clock in the morning. I was lucky to be on one of the last ships. Later on, people flew to Kennedy, but I was on a ship. And my God, you know, when you see the unfathomable creation of New York, which, you know, maybe we take for granted too much, that great cities are works of art, created over time and with so many anonymous creators. But I saw this amazing skyline, which nothing is to prepare you, and also the torch, you know, give me you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. We were yearning, you know, who were we? We were immigrants, no language. My parents were factory workers. And I thought, this is what the site is about. It's about America. It's something that should never be surpassed because it's about those things. And it is connected to a deep Jewish longing. And I think that's what makes me I'm so happy to be Jewish, that I wasn't born in any other faith. Because being Jewish means you're free. You're free. And that's such a kind of mystical idea that Rabbi referred to a little bit in his creation story, but yeah.
Well, that was brilliant. Do we have time for, how are we doing? I promised,
really.
do I have time for another question? Yes? Meryl, I'm looking at you because you're my timekeeper. Meryl, we have time? Back to the Jewish theme. Practicing Judaism has a sense of restriction, following rules. I don't know if you want to speak to that first, or maybe I'll start with Steve. Do you find that it informs or either detracts or helps you in your work, your sense of discipline or your now personal discipline, becoming religious? How does that affect you with your art, or does it?
I could easily be a workaholic, and I could easily work 24/7. And so when we began observing Shabbos, which was a process, not a line in the sand, I found it extremely helpful. And I'm inclined to look for habits and disciplines. That's just a personal trait. And so turning off the phone machine, not composing, saying, okay, I'm going to walk, talk. I'm not going to nowadays have an iPhone. I'm not going to watch television, or I'm going to have to deal with people directly, eat with them, drink with them, talk with them, was enormously humanizing, I think, and in just a personal sense, liberating and...
Recharging.
Excuse me?
Recharging.
Well, recharging, yes, but I was about to say, I think it's a character-building exercise as well. I think I benefited, continue to benefit, and I remember learning somewhere along the line, we keep the Shabbos, but the Shabbos keeps the Jewish people. And that has stayed with me and has grown firm. I mean, I go somewhere and tell them I'm not available Friday night to Saturday. I get away with it now when I'm older, easier. And yeah, there have been books written. I think Joe Lieberman wrote a book, that's for the, it is true for the human race, and what we offer as Jews is really a lot of the Jewish practice. What is it? For me, it boils down to self-discipline. And Pirkei Avos says, who's stronger, the man who controls himself or the man who conquers a city? The man who controls himself. That's the hardest thing in the world. And Shabbos is a very wonderful exercise in doing that. And it has spilled over in a very positive way. I happen to have a good friend, Michael Gordon, who's with Bang on a Can, and Julie Wolfe, and they are Shomer Shabbos, and we brought our granddaughter Aura over there to their house when she was baby Aura, and their daughter Yael, who some of you here know, was there, and sharing this with a fellow artist, because it's very rare to find in the artistic community people who take religion seriously in the world in which we live. I think many of you are aware of that. So in a way, felt a little bit odd and out of place in the community in which I live. And Michael was the same. So having people to share that with was a real gift, and remains one. So the answer to your question is basically yes.
Beryl?
No. Well, I'm not as observant as Steve is. And I would say that when you have a forefather like Abraham who argued with God, that's, to me, that's liberation within Judaism that you were talking about, the freedom. That to me is incredible. I get my discipline from turning on the computer, going into After Effects, and having to move a word down a screen and giving it a time, a position, a transparency. That is my discipline. And Judaism is a discovery into things that I think are true for the world at large. Someone once said, if we don't have anything to say to everybody, we don't have anything to say. So those are the kinds of things that I like to find, and it comes into my work just because that's who I am. I don't really think about it, It's like Dachau didn't come into my life because I wanted to do a piece on a concentration camp. I was going to Germany and I had a response. Text and commentary came into my life because I was in the midst of finding, wow, look what we do. You know, the hypertext, look at this text and how it's read. This is our genius, that we don't just read things this way, that all these voices come into things. So to me, it's just an opening to the world and to putting things together.
Daniel?
You know, Jewishness, being Jewish, is a huge horizon. You know, I've always rejected the narrow ideas of Jews, because Jews cannot be narrowed. The Jewish soul is not a soul that can be subordinated by any ideology. And I come from a family where there are mystics, there are chassids, all my cousins, the only surviving uncle, Uncle Chemia, who was a mystic in Bnei Barak. And I come from, my mother's side, from a very deep, very famous, one of the most famous rabbinical lineages. But at the same time, you know, in my family, there are those who rejected that bind. There are the social democrats, there are the anarchists, there is a spectrum. And to me, I always think of Moses Mendelssohn. He was one of the greatest Jewish thinkers, greatest believers. And what happened to his kids? Every one of them became non-Jewish. He was deeply, every one of his kids became assimilated in Germany. Because it was easy to be, it was easy to succeed if you're assimilated. So to me, to be Jewish is never to be assimilated, but to acquire true Jewish values. Now, what is a true Jewish value? I can only say that my grandmother on my father's side, this is an interesting story. My father came from a very poor family, extremely religious, all his brothers. By the way, one of his brothers was one of the decorated heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Nathan Libeskind. All were religious, deeply religious. My father rejected religion early on. And when his mother was dying, she called him Nachman, come over to me. And on her dying bed, she said, don't say the Kaddish for me because you don't believe in it. And I always thought, you know, my father became he was kind of a tzaddik. He was a very incredibly, I mean, he was kosher, he did not consider himself kosher, but he followed kashrut, you know, totally. So again, I always, it's a mystifying question. The aspiration and the essence of being a Jew cannot be imposed even by the highest authorities in Jewish culture. I'm never impressed by the highest authorities decreeing who is a Jew, because who is a Jew is something far more profound and radical than any of those. Now, it is, I agree with you, that having a discipline, Jewish discipline, might be a great path. But there are, I think, many, many paths to true Jewishness. And they require study, they require commitment, they require something from, let's say, from God. Because I'm lucky that I never searched. You know, I never had to ask the question of what does it mean to be a Jew. I know there's so many people that I know who had to ask themselves the question, what do I do to be a Jew? What do I wear? What do I eat? But somehow, I don't know, I was lucky that the divine grace permitted me to be deeply Jewish without ever having me question, what should I do now to be Jewish? Because every day that question comes in everything you do. And I actually kind of disagree here. I know this might sound really chutzpahdik, but the rabbi said that the God finished the creation. But to me, the creation is not finished. It's the laws have been set, as the rabbi said, but the creation, the question mark that hangs over creation is a continual subordination and also surpassing of all the ideas we have ever had about creation. So it's a deep question. I don't think I can answer it. I don't think there is an easy answer to it. The easy answer is not join this shul or read the following books or wear the kippah. The answer is far more radical, far more radical. It's kind of an attunement and a electricity that has to be connected. And how could you define that moment and that life? It might remain just not pronounceable.
Well, I think we've run out of time. I really appreciate listening to you. To go on for a very long time.